Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
There were still a few hours before the store closed. Adriana habitually went out into the sales room with a bucket and a mop. She mopped the floors, checked the shelves for dust, cleaned up a milk carton that had been dropped, torn, and broken by someone. The senior cashier habitually followed her around, looking for something to pick on. The huge queue at the only open cash register did not embarrass her at all. Of course, the shortcomings in the work of the cleaning lady are much more important than the fulfillment of her own duties. Here's three better. Can't you see it yourself? Sparkled she, poking at the manicured young finger in the very top shelf. Okay. Adriana agreed obediently. I didn't want to argue with the harmful cashier, and it was no use. It would only ruin her. Again she would go and complain to her superiors, saying that our cleaning lady was not doing her job. Shouldn't we fire her? So Adriana just moved a small ladder to the shelf, where Betty noticed the violation, not without some difficulty climbed on it, and a few more times ran a wet rag on the absolutely clean surface. The cashier, who didn't get an excuse for another scandal, pressed her lips together unhappily, but didn't say anything more. Making sure she was far enough away to be out of earshot, Adriana sighed heavily. Betty had disliked her from the first time she'd been in the store, even though there was no objective reason for it. It just happened. You don't like a person at first sight, that's all. As luck would have it, the young one quietly worked hard and fulfilled her duties faithfully, even going out for extra shifts. After all, Adriana was very much in need of any work. And that's why she held on to the job with all her might. Perhaps if she had a little more time, she could have found something less dirty and better paid. But there was no time, and now it was useless to look for something new. Who in their right mind would hire her without much experience, without education? Yeah, and she was pregnant too. So she had to work wherever she managed to get a job, receive a meager salary, and endure the eternal unfair attacks from the staff. Betty not only did not give Adriana life, she also managed to turn the whole team against the girl. And although the others were more restrained, it was impossible not to hear them whispering behind her back. And that she came to work pregnant, she is now on maternity leave, and we do her work. Who will spend money on a temporary cleaner? I wonder if she even knows who the father is. She wouldn't. She's probably out on a drunken bender. What about her mom? She's a known alcoholic, and her dad's the same. The daughter must have followed in their footsteps. I feel sorry for her child. He'll have the same worthless life ahead of him, and her grief is not enough, and do not tell her. Girls like that are contraindicated to reproduce, and they breed like rabbits. There was some truth in those cruel words. Adriana's parents were drunken alcoholics. It was foolish to hide it. It was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. The drunken scandal of her father and mother all the inhabitants went to see even before she was born. Such a peculiar entertainment for a place where there were no other leisure options, except that the girl hadn't lived with her parents for a couple of years. At first, of course, she tried to help them, but quickly realized that it was useless. It is impossible to help someone who does not realize his problems and does not want to solve it. So Adriana had to leave the father's house with a heavy heart and move to rented accommodation. At the same time, she got a fiancé, a student who studied in a neighboring big city, and came to her native place for vacations. It was during one of these visits that the young people met, and everything went well for them until Adriana became pregnant. After learning about the girl's situation, the fiancé disappeared as if he had never existed, finally with a standard set of excuses. I'm sorry, love, but I'm not ready for married life. I've got a lot of schooling to get back on my feet. You realize children are such a responsibility. Well, I can't take it on right now. He couldn't, but she had to. What else could she do? She thought about abortion, of course, but she couldn't make up her mind. And it's past the legal deadline. So you don't want to, but you have to have a child and raise it, even if alone. However, despite all her sorrows, Adriana always remembered that there are those who are worse off than she is. And with all her not great strength, she tried to help these people. Maybe she believed that one day she would be rewarded for her deeds, and in case of insoluble difficulties, there would be someone who would help her. One day, coming back from work, she saw an elderly woman digging in a garbage dump, apparently in search of food. But what was surprising, the stranger didn't look like a typical owner of such places. Granny clothes, albeit odd and 10 times over. The overpayment was clean. There was no characteristic odor of alcohol coming from her either, and it was found in the urn very neatly, with a noticeable disgust for what the grandmother was doing. "Come on," Adriana said as she approached her. "Look, I've got some groceries here. You don't have to pick up junk in the garbage." "Oh, thank you, granddaughter. I'm embarrassed to do it myself, but life made me do it." "What's your name?" "Adriani." "And you're Christina?" "Christina, if your middle name is more convenient. Don't think I'm not homeless. I have a nice big house of my own. But I can't live in it now, and my pension's been delayed. And I want to eat. You know what, Christina, I work at a supermarket nearby, and they let us take expired food for free." "What do you mean expired?" "You can't keep another one on. It's good enough for a quick meal. Come on, instead of rummaging through garbage cans. I'd rather have you pick up these groceries for me if I need them." "Oh, thank you, Adriana." "You're welcome," the girl said. And so it went. About once a week, the grandmother came to the store and the cleaners took out her expired products, and sometimes from fresh from herself added, of course, prepaid. Everything as it should be. Christina did not say anything about it, fearing that she would refuse to accept such gifts. Very soon, Adriana found out that her grandmother lived in an abandoned garage. It took her several days to remove the assorted trash from her temporary shelter, and for days after that, she had to clean the dust and dirt out of the garage. Then came the furniture. Christina collected it from the bulletins, and I slowly dragged it back to my place. They often throw away quite good things, mattresses, chairs, and things like that. I ended up with a pretty decent place to live. How is that possible in these conditions? Of course, you weren't going to do anything like that at first. It had to be cleaned up, but setting up a proper home in the garage was probably not a good idea. Grandma was piously confident that the police would take her application seriously, and very soon she would be able to return home. But time passed, and there was no change. "Of course," said Christina on the subject, "it's the police. People busy with serious matters, they have to catch criminals." But she would probably get half an hour someday to help the poor pensioner. Adriana didn't know exactly what had happened to the poor grandmother's house and why she couldn't return home. It's embarrassing to ask. Besides, why would she need that information? If she could help, Christina would probably tell her. And if she couldn't, why pry? Adriana didn't notice how her working day ended. She went home in high spirits. The next day was going to be her day off, the first for quite a long period of time. She planned to the last detail how she would spend her free time, and with a light heart she went to bed. Tonight, Adriana's mood was not spoiled at all, and in the morning she started the planned tasks. It was high time to clean up the apartment, and then she decided to go for a walk. After all, spring was already steadily coming into its own, and the weather was just fine. It was a sin to sit in four walls on such a day. So Adriana quietly spent her day off, not even suspecting that at this very time at her workplace broke out a real scandal. And what was worse, what was happening there had a direct relation to her and threatened to turn into a real disaster. It all started innocently enough. Still having received the pension, albeit with a slight delay, Christina decided to visit the store, took for a little only a loaf of white bread. One of the cheapest, but she chose a fresher one. Grandma wanted to eat at last a really soft bread among the stale bread. You cannot meet such a thing. Having chosen her loaf, she went to the cash register, calmly put the purchase on the moving belt, and waited for her turn. And as luck would have it, it was at this moment that Betty decided to remember her job description and sat down to punch out purchases to the customers. "That'll be 20R disgruntled," she gave Christina a disdainful look. Now it very complacently provoked the granny, not paying attention to the unfriendly tone of the saleswoman. She stuck her hand into the pocket of her old jacket, and the change was not there. How could it be? She remembered exactly that she had taken it with her. Just in case, she went into the other pocket and gasped. Her hand had fallen into a huge hole. That's where the money had obviously gone to. "Are you going to pay for the purchase?" Raising her voice, Betty asked. "Yes, granddaughter, wait a minute, please. Maybe it's in the other pocket after all." "Grandma, don't delay." Someone's disgruntled voice came from behind. "That's it. First find the money, and then already carry the goods to the cash register," confirmed another. Christina even blushed in shame, apologizing continuously. She tried to take her loaf and return with it to the sales room, either to put it back in its place or to try to look for the missing coins after all. Who's going to pay? Betty screamed throughout the store. "I'm just totally embarrassed, Grandma. It's just in your dumpster." Betty interrupted her, not thinking of lowering her voice. "This is a store. This is where you pay if you take something." "I'm sorry, Christina," began to gingerly retreat to the exit of the supermarket, leaving the unfortunate loaf right at the checkout. The crew hissed unhappily. Whispered, it seemed that everyone who was at that moment in the store, annoyed by this poor beggar. In the opinion of the crowd, she had no place at all in their cozy world, where poor sick invalids and elderly people do not exist. And this, just think about it. Not only did she come to the store, but she had the nerve to lose her pennies. Everyone has to stick around for a few extra minutes because of this. At that moment, Christina stumbled from the shock of not seeing where she was going. She managed to keep her balance, but the bag flew out of her hands, and its contents scattered and fell again. Grandma rushed to gather her unsophisticated possessions. The rumble of the crew grew and became more and more disgruntled. It seemed that it was not people who came to the store for shopping, but a swarm of bees who noticed a stranger in their territory and ready to rush at him at any moment, if he did not immediately disappear. Take the guy who said it. He spoke quietly and calmly. But amid the contemptuous gull, there were whispers from the crowd. It seemed to everyone that he practically shouted his phrase. As he did so, he passed a substantial handful of coins into the cashier's hands. "Count it. There should be plenty in there." "You should be ashamed to offend an old woman. You'll be like that yourself one day," and paying no more attention to Betty or the people. In line, he started to help Christina by packing all her things. "I didn't forget to put the unfortunate loaf on top." "Thank you, grandson." Almost in a whisper, she said, and hurried as quickly as possible to leave the store. Need I say that the main victims in this conflict love solemnly appointed herself. So how dare these dare to speak to her in such a tone? What do they think of themselves at all? First, it's a grandmother, and her granddaughter. There's no data around or her grandmother. Besides, it's not clear if she really lost the money or if she was just playing a comedy. So some smug idiot would pay her for the goods. And the amazing thing is, there was one. And he's lecturing the old people, saying she's insulting them. If you're of a certain age, you're allowed to do anything. Betty didn't want to be treated like that. She was a serious girl. She wasn't to be trifled with. And in this store, no one dared to cross her. Of course they did. Everyone knew she was in a relationship with the owner of the supermarket. Even though they both denied it, it's understandable. He's a married man. Of course, he hasn't lived with his wife for a long time. But divorce and having a mistress is a big stain on his reputation. So he has to deny it. In short, Betty was terribly offended by both the old woman and the guy. And most of all, Adriana. The cashier didn't like her enough as it was. And now she's got this old lady feeding her overdue groceries. That's why she got mad. So the cleaning lady is to blame for the whole thing. And we have to get back at her somehow. Thinking about all this, Betty suddenly came up with an idea that had never occurred to her before, although it was on the surface. After all, it was possible to realize it since Adriana started to pocket her grandmother, and already then to get rid of her snobbishly and clean her once and for all. And how come she hadn't realized it before? However, now everything will go the way she wants. Hitting the back room, she picked up her phone and looked at it thoughtfully. She had to tune in to portray universal sorrow and simultaneously offended innocence. Everything had to sound authentic and convincing. And she only had one shot at it. Finally, he felt he was ready. The woman dialed the cherished number. "Honey," she began in a weak voice, sobbing. Every word. "Honey, I told you I warned you about that cleaning lady. And now I was right again. What's wrong?" "Betty, explain it to me like a human being. Remember, she's got this thing about feeding the homeless, the procrastinators. We've been over this. You and I may not be comfortable with that behavior, but the rules don't prohibit it." "And are the rules allowed?" with an offended tone. Betty asked. "Taking normal groceries out of the store without paying for them?" "Well, of course not." So this cleaning lady of yours, as it turned out, was taking out her dough under the guise of expired goods, good food, goods that could be sold. Then we'll wonder where the inspections are coming up with these huge shortages. It's true. The shopkeeper's tone changed subtly. "I'm not going to lie to you, am I? Look at the cameras yourself, if you don't trust me." "I will," he muttered shortly and grimly, hanging up the phone. Betty cheered. She was sure her version would be more convincing to the shopkeeper than anything the hated cleaning lady could say for herself. Not so long ago, she had been watching the camera footage herself and had noticed Adriana taking a carton of milk right off the shelf in the middle of the workday and then giving it to that nasty old woman. The cashier, of course, had punched in the purchase herself and knew perfectly well that it was paid for. But the owner of the store was not aware of it. And the cash register broke down that day, so it's her word against the cleaning ladies. Perfect plan. The next day, Adriana unsuspectingly showed up at her workplace, prepared the necessary inventory, household chemicals, even had time to tidy up the store before it opened. Then Betty showed up, contrary to usual, friendly and welcoming. That fact alone should have alerted the girl, but she didn't want to spoil her mood, which was still excellent, and for nothing. However, even if Adriana paid attention to the changed behavior of her colleague, could it change anything? After all, her fateful decision had obviously been made by the owner of the supermarket long before he came to the store in the middle of the day and demanded that the cleaner come to him immediately. In the office, in addition to the owner himself, was Betty. And if in the morning she had been glowing with joy, now she stood there looking sad and serious. It was impossible not to suspect something wrong. Adriana began the host in a stern tone. "Did you really think that your machinations could go unnoticed?" "What machinations?" Adriana was surprised, not knowing what she was talking about. "Tell us about your shenanigans, Betty. What kind of products do you feed the local elderly homeless?" "I take the expired stuff too. As far as I know, it's not illegal." "Then how can you explain this?" The cashier jabbed her finger at the computer monitor, the boss, where he was just turning on the tape from the surveillance camera that stood in the hall. The one where Adriana was taking fresh milk from the shelf. Next to it was another video of her handing that carton to Christina. "This milk. I bought it with my own money," Adriana replied immediately. "Betty, you were the one who punched it in for me." You see, Kevin, how she communicates. No respect, no chain of command. Adriana was taken aback. Everyone in the store used to address each other on a first-name basis, and no one ever saw a problem with it, including when high-ranking officials came to visit. But apparently, it was at this moment that the rules changed dramatically for her. "I see," the chief said dryly. "As for that package, I don't remember selling it to you." "But there was a camera right above the cash register," Adriana said timidly. "Surprisingly, it's very convenient for you the camera wasn't working that day." Betty's talking again. "Is that a coincidence? And if you can't come up with any more coherent arguments in your defense," Kevin summed up, "as of this minute you are fired and the rest of your paycheck will be deducted from the fine." Adriana understood. It was absolutely useless to argue with these two. Betty has already convinced the shopkeeper of her version of events, and nothing will make him change his mind. Unless there's a tape of her buying that wretched carton of milk. But of course she had no such tape, so there was nothing to talk about. The only thing Adriana had the strength to do was not to burst into tears in the office. But as soon as she left the store, a stream of tears, pain and resentment rushed out of her voice. Despair filled the girl's entire being, making her shudder with new bouts of crying. She almost didn't see where she was going and almost bumped into Christina on the way. "God, Adriana." "Granddaughter, what is the matter with you?" In horror exclaimed the kind grandmother, seeing the state in which the former cleaner is already fired. Adriana sobbed. How to pay the rent now? What to feed the child when it is born? Who will hire me in such a situation? Well, you'll be sad, granddaughter. Everything will work out somehow. You'll see. My life isn't easy either, but I still try to live. Not to kill myself, but to find something joyful in every moment. I wasn't always a lonely old woman living in someone else's garage. My family had a husband, Robert, a good, hardworking. He built us a luxury house from the foundation, and all with his own hands. No work was no stranger. And he loved me. And how much I loved him words can't express. And so for several years we burned ourselves with him. First, we built the house. Then we made it cozy. The young were hot. Then we went out. Of course, it was time for the kids to think. And soon we had a son named Christopher. I don't know who he was born like that. Yes, but he was a real bully, and even in his school years did not give peace to neither teachers nor classmates. Always making things up, always getting into some dubious mess. We were mixed, and then we wrote it all off as childish pranks. They said he'd grow up and wise up, and at his age, who among us wasn't? Yeah, I guess we must have missed something in our upbringing. He finished school all right. He wasn't stupid, but where to go next? He couldn't make up his mind. He switched institutes. He left after the first year, and sometimes in the middle of the year he was looking for his true purpose. I was interested in everything, but I couldn't concentrate on one thing. I wish Robert and I had some kind of intervention. No, we thought we'd let the boy do the searching. He can't just do nothing. Now he'll find something he likes and everything will be fine. We weren't old, we were both working. We could afford to support him for a few more years. And he didn't need any special expenses. He didn't drink, didn't smoke. And for his other desires, he earned himself. Then here to work as a loader, then there as a courier, and then he wanted to drive a car. To our misfortune, we again didn't mind even money. As much as we could, added to the case. He went to a driving school. He even bought a foreign car, though not a new one. The whole family was happy then. And then he thought, and went to pry money not bad to get a good start. And said that this was his destiny, what he wanted to do all his life. Of course, we didn't expect that, but we accepted his life as not ours. Anyway, it didn't end well. He kept chasing expensive orders. I've traveled to all sorts of remote places. And that time I came back late and tired. It was his birthday. He was in a hurry. He really wanted to celebrate with us. He never made it to the end of the day. He crashed. They say he lost control because he was going too fast. Maybe he did. Who can tell now? And you're not going to get that son of a bitch back. Robert was worried sick. He loved him very much. How did he find out? He went to the hospital with a bad heart. He never came out of there. He couldn't bear to see his son die. I was stronger than him, I guess. I suffered, of course, agonized, cried, wanted to leave for them. And then it got easier. But of course, it will never go away. I never got married a second time, although I could have, when I was less than 50. A lot of people find love at an older age. I guess I didn't need it. I found solace in something else. I started feeding homeless animals. First from my paycheck and then from my pension. That's how I got this feeling that someone in this world needs me, that I can help. In addition to food, I also took some goodies of different bones, sausages, pads of all sorts. Oh, love me my homeless, and I am still probably waiting for them. I hope they do someday, but I can't go on like this. Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'll get to that. That day I got my pension too. So I bought all kinds of animals. I fed them all, everyone was happy. And then I went to the store again to buy a little something for myself. That's when my story began again. I went to the store. I see a young, beautiful girl standing there, but she's very sad. And they don't seem to be begging. But a look of begging, as if waiting for help. And she's shivering like she's got chills. I went up to her and said, "What's wrong, granddaughter? Can I help you?" And she started to cry, shaking, coughing, clearly sick. She's been sick for a long time. And she answers, "I don't know, Grandma. What can I do to help? I've been away from home for days, driving around." Where do I go? I don't know. There's no life for me at home. My mom died a couple of years ago, and my dad. I used to stay with my stepdad, but he's a heavy drinker. And when he drinks, he gets violent, you know? No, I'll die, but I won't go back to him. What are you talking about? Granddaughter. I answered her, why should you die? You're young, you'll live to see it. Let's go to my place. I have plenty of room for you. And there was indeed room. I had a good house, and most importantly, a big one. Too big for one poor woman. And so someone alive around will be together. It's more fun and easier to live. The girl was really seriously ill and even caught pneumonia. But nothing in the exit she was cured. Although the first week was really hard. She sometimes fell into delirium, and I had to almost forcefully drug her. But we got out. I still had nowhere to go, but she stayed with me. And at first everything went well, and you could talk to her and helped her with the household, although it was a bit difficult. It was hard to feed 2 people on 1 pension, but she promised she'd find a job soon. She just needed to get better and stronger. Otherwise, God forbid, the disease would return. I wasn't in any hurry. I managed on my own, but then it got really bad. She brought her fiancé later. I don't know where or how they met. Only the guy was a real misfortune to work. He didn't work, and he drank too. So my girl started to join him. I tried to talk them down, but all in vain. One day I come home. I can't get in. My tenants must have changed the locks while I was out on business. That's how I became homeless. I'm lucky I found this garage. Otherwise, it would have been a disaster. But it's nothing like a palace, of course, but not without a roof over our heads. Why didn't you go to the police? Adriana was surprised. She didn't notice how she stopped crying. Christina's story so engrossed the girl that she somehow forgot about her own sorrows. That's how it is. Grandma had it much worse than she did. She's not discouraged, she's doing great. Yes, I did, granddaughter, I did. I told you, but it's all the same. I understand your problem, but there's too much to do right now. When we have time, we'll figure it out. But I guess they don't have time. I guess they will someday. So we went our separate ways. Grandma went to her garage. I'm tormented by guilt. She must have lost her job because of that scandal at the store. Everyone knew Adriana was feeding her. So they decided to take revenge through an innocent man. Adriana, for her part, was experiencing similar torment on her breasts. Christina, with her problems, as if life was too good without them. But grandmothers are kind and caring. Now it's probably because of that. But still, actually, the troubles pushed these thoughts to the background of consciousness quite quickly. Maybe this wouldn't have happened if Adriana had been alone and responsible for herself. But she was expecting a child, so she was also responsible for this life that had not yet taken place. And she had to find a way out of it. Find a job. She didn't even have a place of her own. It's a rented apartment. Some savings Adriana, of course, had, but the maximum for what they would be enough for another month of rent. And then where to? To her parents who drink, make terrible scandals, or even fight. No, this was not the right life for her. But it was even more unsuitable for a newborn baby. And how could one be sure in this environment that the baby would basically come into this world and appear alive and healthy? It's scary to imagine what could happen if she returned to her parents' home. No, this option is definitely not suitable. But where to find a job for a woman who is 5 months pregnant? Her tummy's not too big yet, but it's quite noticeable. You can't hide it. And it is not good to deceive people. But if nothing is done, no job will come along. So Adriana started looking. She sent out resumes for various vacancies, from the same cleaners to dishwashers to saleswomen and even couriers. In short, she searched for all positions that do not require any special qualifications. And quite expectedly, every time the same story was repeated. Everything was going well, and she was even ready to accept. But that is, until Adriana showed up for a face-to-face meeting. There the potential employer glanced at her belly and immediately lost all interest in her. Directly, of course. No one voiced the reason for the refusal. After all, it was simply illegal. But the girl was not a fool and understood perfectly well what was going on. The closer the day came, when it would be time to make the next payment for the apartment, the more Adriana's hands were down. She, of course, did not stop her search, but they became more and more sluggish. The girl again began to fall into the abyss of despair, from which she was so successfully pulled out by Christina. And so they met by chance, when Adriana was returning from another failed job interview. And at first sight, she didn't even recognize Christina. She looked a dozen years younger. In addition, she was wearing a new fashionable coat instead of the usual old holey jacket. But most importantly, it was as if her grandmother was glowing from the inside out. "Adriana," she exclaimed happily. "Oh, I'm so glad we got to meet again. I wish I'd found you sooner. But that's the problem. We haven't exchanged phone numbers, and I don't know your address. They wouldn't even let me into the store where you used to work. I'm glad, Christina. I see things are getting better for you." Adriana was really happy to see her grandmother up close. It was obvious that her life had changed for the better. That was good. At least someone in this life is lucky, especially someone so bright. "You got that right. Things are getting better," I replied to Grandma. "It's getting better. Can you believe I got my house back?" "Wow, that's great. Did the police finally come through?" "Alas, the police are still very busy and couldn't give me the time of day. But the guy who stood up for me at the store did." "Oh, you don't know about that case." And Christina briefly told Adriana what happened the day before she was fired. "So I'm sorry, granddaughter. I'm the one who got you fired from your job." "Oh, you don't say. So Christina Betty, the cashier who was rude to you? You've had it in for me for a long time. She would have found a reason without you. A reason, I'm sure. That's it." Granny sighed. "Well, God help her. So I met this kid on the street, just like you are now. Can you imagine him? You see, it turns out his name is like my dead son, and he works as a cab driver too. He's as polite as he saw me. He remembered me right away, asked me how I was doing, if I needed anything. And then he started asking me how I got to this life. I didn't want to say anything at first. I didn't want to burden a man with my troubles for nothing. But I told you once, cab drivers aren't like that. And when he found out that they took away my house, he gathered his colleagues, and they all together kicked out those ungrateful young people from my house. I invited him to live with me for that. He's a widower with 2 small children, and like you, he lived in a rented apartment. There's not a lot of space there. I have a nice, big house, plenty of room for everyone. And for you too, granddaughter. Come to our house too." "Come on," Christina waved Adriana away. "It's uncomfortable. As my Rick used to say, it's uncomfortable to sleep on the ceiling. The blanket falls down. Don't be embarrassed. We do have plenty of room. You've been so helpful when I needed it, haven't you? What would I do without you? And you lost your job because of me?" Yeah, I remember what you said about that. But it's still partly my fault. I don't know what to say." Adriana said uncertainly, "It's all so sudden. But don't be in a hurry, granddaughter. Think it over. Let me write you the address. We won't lose it. And remember, you'll always be welcome. Come and visit us sometime, and then you'll stay." Adriana pondered Christina's proposal for several days. And in the end, she came to the conclusion that she should accept it. At least she would stay with her grandmother for a while, and then she would get back on her feet. She had no other options anyway. She came to the address. "Look, I'll give it to you. It's really huge." It seemed that several people living there could never cross paths with each other if they wanted to. Perhaps it really does not interfere with anyone here. Neither the hostess herself, nor her guest of honor with her children. Even having made that decision, she stood for a few moments at the entrance, hesitating to call. But then, of course, she pressed the button. The door opened almost immediately, as if the inhabitants of the house had been waiting all day for her to arrive. On the threshold, contrary to her expectations, stood not Christina at all. It was a man clearly older than her, but still quite young. And, as Adriana immediately pointed out, quite attractive, at least from her point of view. But he said it in a slightly surprised tone, as if he expected to see someone else on the doorstep. "You must be Adriana, and you must be Rick." She smiled back. "All right. I'm sorry, I thought it was my oldest calling." I sent him to take out the trash. Now I'm sitting here waiting. I'm worried sick about him. I mean, he's only 6, and he's already trying to be independent. Really, when you think about it, he'd rather knock. But that's a long way from a bell. I understand your concern, but I'd probably freak out too if it was my kid. But you, as far as I'm concerned, have yet to have it. Rick said with a smile. Oh, where are my manners? Why do I keep you on the doorstep? Come on in. Christina's at the store now, but I'm sure she'll be glad to see you when she gets back. All these days, I've been talking about how nice it would be if Adriana's granddaughter could find time to visit us. The girl was about to accept this kind invitation and go inside the house when she heard a loud and joyful shout behind her, Dad, I'm back. She turned around and saw a little boy who was jumping up and running toward them. Even from the impressive distance separating them, she noticed that the child had the same dark blonde hair, the same eye slit, and the same ears as the father standing next to her. Even if she didn't know that Rick had a 6-year-old son, surely she would have guessed who was in front of her. Ouch, exclaimed the boy, noticing Adriana. He also made an effort to slow down and no longer ran, but just walked quickly, trying not to bounce at every step. Sometimes, however, he forgot about this decision and started to run again, but he immediately pulled himself back. It looked both comical and very touching. Hello, he said clearly, coming up close to his father and his companion. My name is James, and you must be Adriana, grandmother, we've been hearing all about you. Jam, his father gently reprimanded him. Is it normal to use those words when talking about your grandmother? Sorry, Dad, the boy corrected himself immediately. She talked about you a lot, said she'd always be happy to see you. And if she's happy, so are we. All 3 of us finally went into the house. There, sitting on the ottoman by the door, a second child was waiting for them. Also a boy. Adriana would have guessed him to be about 3 years old, and as it turned out later, she was not mistaken in her assumptions. It was Charles who hastened to introduce him to James, my younger brother. He doesn't talk very well yet, but we'll soon correct that. Charles, this is Aunt Adriana. Charles immediately smiled and clapped his hands together happily, then jumped up from his seat, ran over to the girl, and hugged her tightly. Apparently, in this house, her name was synonymous with something very good. Adriana leaned over and ruffled the baby's hair. Soon Christina herself returned as well when the landlady saw Adriana. There was no limit to her joy, and when the girl confessed that she was going to accept her offer and move in with them in an ultimatum tone, she said that the matter should be celebrated. Barely managed to persuade grandmother that there was no need to run back to the store right now to buy and cook something more festive. They decided that the feast in honor of Adriana's arrival could well wait until the next day. But the day after Christina went out, bought a cake of different delicious things to cook. Since then, they all started to live together as one big family. Rick treated his grandmother like his own mother. He never even knew his biological parents. He grew up in an orphanage, and now, as an adult, he had a real family. Adriana had similar feelings for Christina. She knew her parents well, of course, but she wasn't sure they were any better than Rick had been. Sometimes she felt like she would have been better off growing up in an orphanage than in the kind of environment she had at home. That was unlikely. Convinced, the man answered her as she spoke her thoughts aloud. Do you even know who they are? I don't know anything about mine. Alive or dead. They were good people. I don't even know their names. Maybe it's for the best. I disagreed, Adriana. You'd be pleased if they turned out to be, say, drunkards and slackers like mine. As it is, you might think they were decent people who were just unlucky. That's probably true. Rick finally agreed. The young men did not notice how they began to grow closer to each other. At first, they were embarrassed, and they tried not to meet much within the house. Gradually, the embarrassment disappeared, and meeting at the refrigerator no longer caused an awkward silence. After a mutual greeting, they began to discuss the weather and have other meaningless conversations. Then to their conversations began to add some household trivia. After all, the stove's been acting up since this morning. All right, Adriana, I'll have it looked at. At this point, they just naturally and imperceptibly switched to you. Neither of them suggested it. The young people didn't agree to it in any way. Everything happened by itself, and very soon it seemed to them that it had always been like that. And then they also smoothly, naturally, began to discuss with each other and quite personal topics. Adriana told Rick about her childhood and about her unhappy love, and about her unsuccessful job. He, in turn, also shared how he lived. I don't even know what to tell you that I'm coming. This you already know. While in the orphanage lived different things, there were good and bad. It's been so long. What's there to remember now? Nobody liked me anyway. I got out when I turned 18. I went to driving school. I'll get my license. I really wanted to drive. I didn't have money for a car, obviously, so I got a job at a taxi company. I stayed there. It was a good job, and the pay was decent, so I drove around. One day, I got a passenger, a girl, unremarkable. I certainly didn't think she was pretty at the time. But as it turned out, that wasn't the main thing. She told me stories the whole way. Can you imagine what kind of stories? Adriana was interested. They're all made up. About all sorts of incredible places and fairy tale creatures. She made them up herself, and she was really good at it. I even encouraged her to write it all down and maybe submit it to a publisher. Yeah, she didn't want to do that. At home, you've already realized I'm talking about my wife. She and I exchanged phone numbers after that trip. Then we started dating. Eventually, as you can see, we got married. She had James, then Charles. They must have had the best bedtime stories. Adriana smiled. They sure were. Rick echoed her. But she's been gone a year now. She was so young. And she died of cancer. Can you believe it? When we found out, there was nothing we could do. I really feel for you, don't you? From your story, you really loved her, didn't you? Yes, I did. But I didn't have much time to grieve. 2 little kids to take care of. Sometimes I hired a nanny, but I tried to do more on my own. I took her to work with me. The people there were understanding. It's good to have a friendly teen at work. I'm sorry you weren't so lucky, but it's okay. Everything's gonna be all right now. I hope so, Adriana said thoughtfully. Soon the girl began to watch Rick's children while he was away from home. And it happened quite often. After all, the man had to work hard to adequately support his family. After a couple of weeks, little Charles was already calling her mommy. James, who remembered his own mother well, did not, but he still treated Adriana with obvious warmth. It was more than she could have hoped for. They had lived at Christina's for only a few months until Rick had come home with a bouquet of flowers and presented it to Adriana. She was pleased, of course, but also surprised. What was this in honor of? She looked carefully at Rick, who was behaving unusually, to say the least. Normally, this man just radiated confidence, yet he was smiling and blushing like a schoolboy trying to kiss a girl he liked for the first time. Adriana, I don't know. You might find it inappropriate. And it's been such a short time since my wife died. But when you came into my life, I realized I was ready to move on. This may sound silly, but I love you. Now it was the girl's turn to blush and be embarrassed. But in the end, she was able to overcome the shyness and answer, I care about you too. Finally, Christina's voice came from the next room. I was also afraid that you two would never explain each other. And just a few days after this conversation, Adriana went into labor. So their large family was replenished with a girl who was named Christina. Rick immediately adopted the child and gave her his last name. And when Adriana recovered a little after childbirth, played a wedding. It was held on a rather quiet modestly. From the guests, Christina and a few colleagues, Rick. And of course, the children. Adriana thought for a long time whether to invite her parents too. But in the end, she came to the conclusion that it's not worth it. Of course, this decision was not easy for her. They weren't exactly strangers to her. Besides, if she found out that her daughter was getting married and they weren't invited, there would be a scandal. But the blessing was over. After the wedding, they continued to live as before in Christina's big house. And everything would have been fine, but the landlady started to give up. She'd get a heart attack, a stomach ache, or suddenly she couldn't breathe. She had to go to the doctors. Granny didn't agree for quite a long time. Oh, what will they do there? It's age. We haven't invented a cure for old age yet, so why distract people from their work? Would you go anyway? Christina, Adriana urged her. What if something could be done? Her husband was really supportive. I know from bitter experience that the sooner you go to the doctor, the better chance he can help you. Or it could get worse, and then it's too late. After some time, they managed to persuade the grandmother to go and have her health checked. However, the results of this examination showed that Christina was, in general, right. What did she report after going to the clinic? Like I said, age-related changes, a little bit of everything. And there's nothing to treat. They prescribed some general, strengthened their vitamins, and let her go. Despite this condition, the grandmother continued to deteriorate rapidly. The spouses first enrolled her in a private clinic, and then began to invite doctors to the house. All to no avail. Well, you'll have it, Christina said one day. Enough of these clinics, doctors, examinations, and everything else. If I'm going to die soon, I want to go quietly, peacefully at home. What are you talking about? Adriana said fearfully. Of course you won't die. We'll all be there someday, granddaughter. With light sadness in her voice, said Christina. I feel that I'm going to die soon, but that's no reason to be upset. My darlings, they're waiting for me in the other world. You know that. These words were a little consolation to the couple. Each of them had found a long-lost mother in the person of the kind hostess. However, sadly, the more time passed, the more they became convinced that Christina was right. A year later, she could hardly walk. Of course, Adriana and Rick helped in any way they could. They freed her from any housework and bought her medication. The young mother took her grandmother out for a breath of fresh air, firmly supporting her under her arm. Some more time passed, and Christina became completely ill. Her whole body was paralyzed. She couldn't even get out of bed. She was also in constant, severe pain. All the doctors could do was prescribe medication to ease the pain. Adriana was practically nonstop, sitting by the bedside sick. She even learned how to handle the IV and other simple medical devices. So all the care Christina needed, she took care of herself. You'll have a granddaughter, a weak voice persuaded her grandmother. What's the use of sitting by the bedside of a dying old woman? You have children, they need your attention. Do you need it too? Adriana argued. Maybe even more than they do now, Adriana. Christina sighed tiredly. Soon she stopped talking too. Here Adriana still had to come to terms with the idea that there was nothing more to help, no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried. The outcome was a foregone conclusion, and a few days later Christina was gone. Neither spouse had any idea did she have any living relatives or any old friends, buddies left. After all, in recent years she lived quite unsociable, communicated only with the two of them, yes, with their children. However, at the funeral organized by Rick at Adriana was not quite empty. Some of the inhabitants of the town came to say goodbye to the grandmother. No surprise there. Many people here knew Christina and many loved her. Toward the end of the modest ceremony, she was visited by the strangest of guests, a pack of stray dogs. Quietly and stealthily, they appeared out of the darkness, not approaching the people. Too close, they settled around and watched silently for a while. Then they left, making a shrill, pitifully lively sound. She'd been feeding them, hadn't she? Adriana remembered. So they came? I don't think so. Someone objected. You can't humanize animals. They were just looking for food. Christina, we didn't agree with you. Adriana replied with a sob. Maybe so, but an old man can afford such quirks. But it is somehow indecent for you to lecture at a funeral. The husband stood up for Adriana. Let's do without silly squabbles on such a day. That's right, agreed their companion. She wouldn't have approved of that. She was a good woman. Right, and who were you to her? Adriana asked. Let's say, a man she helped a lot in her time, and who returned her black in gratitude. Rick added unexpectedly. It took me a while to recognize you, I admit. You're the one who squatted on Christina's house and forced her to live in someone else's garage for a year. It's true, the guy didn't deny it. Believe it or not. But I'm really ashamed of it now. I've been looking for a chance to go to her, apologize. apologize. Maybe offer some help, but I didn't dare. Then I heard a rumor that the funeral was today. I thought I should at least come to say goodbye. My wife would like to come too. But alas, she's out of town now. She's studying in the capital. He said the last sentence with a noticeable pride. My wife is then the very girl whom our Christina took to her sick and nursed her back to health. And it was she. Well, the deceased would no doubt be pleased that you too have taken to your wits. At the conclusion of the ceremony, an artificial stone-cut monument was placed on Christina's fresh grave. It was a bust of her with small figures of people and animals next to it. Adriana and Rick developed this design together. They were very proud of what they came up with, and not everyone who attended the funeral appreciated the design. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they were both sure that Grandma herself liked it. The spouses returned home and knew both physically and mentally. The day was very hard, and all they could think about was how to be in bed as soon as possible. Lucky for them, James was a golden boy, responsible and obedient on days like today. It was no trouble at all for him to look after the younger ones, while his parents rested. It had been 3 years since the wedding, and the child had grown accustomed to calling Adriana Mom, and Christina had been his little sister since birth. The night passed without incident. As always, James perfectly coped with the voluntarily assumed mission of caring for the younger ones, allowing the parents to get a good night's sleep. And in the morning, they realized they were in a very unpleasant situation. "You know, Adriana," Rick said thoughtfully, "you and I have no right to live in this house." She looked at her husband in surprise. "I mean legally. We are not relatives or even distant relatives. And purely formally we have nothing to do with her at all. And therefore, am the right to occupy this room." Adriana really went ballistic. "What is it again under a rented apartment to move? What can I do?" Rick sighed. "It's not like we're breaking the law because we have some reason to think this house is ours." "Of course you're right, honey." They decided, however, that it wouldn't be a bad idea to stay a while longer, just long enough to find a new place to live. Of course, both of them had experience in finding rented apartments, but now they needed a little more space than before. After all, they were going to live in St. Petersburg. It was unlikely that a standard 2-bedroom would be suitable here, and that meant that the selection process could take a little longer. Not on the street all this time to spend the night, especially with small children. Nevertheless, the couple began to slowly pack their things so that they could leave. As soon as they found a suitable option, they tried to do it discreetly, not yet knowing how to explain to the children why they couldn't stay in this house. They were adults. They understood that whatever relations they had with Christina, they were not relatives. The children, on the other hand, were not privy to such subtleties. For each of them, the old woman was just a grandmother, and only Christina was small enough not to understand at all the essence of what was happening, and did not need, accordingly, in explanations. On one of these hardscrabble days, Adriana decided to sort through a small folder of their papers. There were marriage certificates, children's birth certificates, and other papers that could be useful, including even her school certificate, which showed that she had graduated from high school with honors. As soon as Adriana opened the folder, she noticed something unusual. Right on top of everything else was a document that had not been there before. She examined the blue seal. The paper was notarized, and at the top in large letters was a will. With some trepidation, Adriana picked up the document that held what was obviously Christina's last will. She tried to read it, but the lines were scrawled before her eyes. Not without some surprise, the woman noticed that it was tears that were covering her eyes, preventing her from focusing on the text. But why hadn't she gotten in here sooner? Surely the will must have listed relatives or friends, maybe even from other cities. Now it turns out they didn't even get to Christina's funeral. That must be a shame for them. But in any case, now it will be possible to find them there and report what happened. And why hide the will? Grandma wasn't shy about talking about her imminent death. She could have openly handed the document to the people around her. And if Adriana hadn't gone into that file now, when would it have been found? Did Christina really think there would be no offense when she saw the text? Adriana made another attempt to familiarize herself with the contents of the document. She wiped her tears and forced herself to stop crying for at least a minute. I struggled to look at the lines and finally managed to read what the will said. It came as a bit of a shock. Anything. Adriana could expect anything from that paper, but not what she saw in it. She must have been so convinced of the idea that they would have to leave the house that her brain refused to accept any other information. Meanwhile, in the will it was written in black and white that Christina wished to leave all her property to Rick, Adriana, and their children present and future. It wasn't until a few minutes later that Adriana was able to appreciate the real meaning of the find. After all, it meant that the house now belonged to them. Officially, all the legal formalities had been fulfilled, and there was no need to pack up, no need to upset the children, and no need to hang around from one rental apartment to another. When Rick returned from work, he was also in for a shocking but pleasant surprise. His wife, without saying a word, but with this look of conspiratorial joy, handed him Christina's will. Emotions overwhelmed both were so great that they did not embrace and cried, both from joy and gratitude to the kind grandmother, who did not leave them even after death. If you enjoyed the story, please support me with a thumbs up button. It's only one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you in advance.